good? We are on. Okay. And I'm also gonna, you are not on video. There is, as you can see, a sticky note on my camera. Nobody can see you. But also the microphone will pick you up better if it's facing that way. Okay, so I think that probably you're all familiar with what drought is, but I threw this up here just as an introduction to make sure that we all know what we're talking about when we're talking about drought. You talked a lot about the things that you remember, some of the impacts that you've seen from past droughts. So drought has climate factors. It's also got, impacts that don't necessarily relate directly to climate, but that end up showing up sort of as second tier things, things like weeds, for example. So this is the sort of situation that we're talking about today. Now, one of you will have seen these words before because you were at the drought tournament. In fact, this text may look familiar to you, Leo. A couple of other terms that we're going to be talking about today are vulnerabilities and impacts. So the stuff that you just listed out, those are impacts. So an impact is a negative effect that is directly resulting from drought. Okay. A vulnerability is something, it can be a particular segment of people in society who have some kind of characteristic, whether it's age or health or economic circumstances or something, that make them particularly negatively affected by an impact. So we're going to be sorting things today into the impacts of drought and then who is particularly vulnerable to those kinds of impacts. Does that make sense so far? Okay. The other couple of terms that I want to talk about, on this page, they are. Recovery is not on here, but we're going to talk about it anyway. Are mitigation, response, and recovery, which are words that I used in the first meeting last week. Mitigation strategies are things that you do before a drought happens to set you up better before it gets here. Sort of like what Leo was talking about, like crop insurance, things that you do ahead of time to prepare. Response strategies are things that you do while the drought is happening to try to address some of those challenges of just getting through it when it's happening. And then recovery is the stuff that you do afterwards to try to get the community, get yourselves back on your feet again, or back on, to finish addressing some of those impacts and sort of get yourself back to normal. Does all of that make sense? Great. That's all I need that for. Oh, I can't close that. Okay, so you will all notice that you have sticky notes and markers in front of you. What I want you to do right now, and you can take some of these that you've already talked about and you write those down, or you can write completely new ones. I want you to start thinking about the impacts of drought. What are the negative effects of drought? And write one on, you don't write more than one on a sticky note. And then when you do that, I want you to bring them up here and I want you to put them where you think they belong. So is the impact something that happens beforehand, or is it something that's going on beforehand? Is it something that's going on during the drought? Is it something that tends to show up after a drought? And then once you do that, we're going to talk a little bit about who is particularly vulnerable in those circumstances and what the short-term and long-term timescales are for some of those impacts. Does that make sense?
I'm struggling with the point where you declare a drought, but as ag people, we're always hopeful that it's going to rain tomorrow. It's going to rain.
That's true.
So where do you draw the point that says drought time? Do you wait till your crop is already in the ground and you're have we water more, or you're
Sure.
thinking about the rain? At what point do you say we're in a drought?
Sure. Well, there are a couple of different ways that drought is classified. So there's the agricultural drought, which is kind of what you're talking about with the physical effects on the crops.
Right.
There's also a hydrologic drought, which is based on what your water supplies look like, you know, be they in the river or what's falling out of the sky or what your aquifer looks like. Drought can also be classified based on soil moisture. Like you might have a pretty decent amount of rain, but if your soil is super dry because it's really hot and windy and it just can't retain that moisture, that's also a form of drought.
So what are we focusing on? Like, what's the hydrologic drought, or are we focusing?
That is the thing that people tend to think about because it's the easy one, the easiest one for everybody to see. It stops raining, everybody can see that it stops raining. Or the river is low, everybody can see that. One of the, well, actually, I can show you this now. This will also.
I guess when I think of
Look there.
energy, you guys are working with underground water.
That is true.
Is that what we're looking for?
Um,
How much are you guys involved in actually drought?
well, sort of, yeah, right. Sort of, not really. Let me look for this guy. Okay, so one of the things, and this is something that's going to get talked about in the Drought Tools workshop in May. Let me see if I can blow that up a smidge. So something that, you know, the thing, I think you're sort of talking about what is drought, how do you decide it's drought? And I think you're also, if I'm not mistaken, you're kind of asking about how do you know it's coming?
Is that the
Right.
present drought monitor?
That's not today's, no. I can show you today. There it is, if you want to see it. This is an example.
This is what?
This is an example.
Yep.
One of the things that gets put out every week by the National Drought Mitigation Center is something called a Drought Monitor. And so they take all of those factors, soil moisture, crops, precipitation, stream flows, all of that stuff, and they do a whole bunch of calculations, and then they draw a map that looks a lot like that. And they classify areas based on whether they're getting a little dry, but you're not quite in drought yet. And then they go from there to you're in moderate drought, you're in extreme drought, you're in exceptional drought, you're in holy crap drought. So there are tools like this one and a lot of other ones that are out there that are sort of constantly tracking climate information, they're tracking stream flow information. There's a drought impact report that's looking for people to send them information on things like what are the crops doing. And the idea is to put all of that information together, not just to figure out when droughts actually happened once you're there, but to try to see it coming. Sometimes it's still hard to see it coming. They called 2012 a flash drought because it just sort of boom, there it was. But something like the drought of the 2000s, which was much slower and much longer, that one, if you had all of your data and information in a row, probably would have been easier to sort of see that building up until you were actually in what you would call drought. So one of the things that a lot of people are trying to work on is how to get better at that. So there are these monitoring tools, there are these sources of data, but sometimes what somebody might call a drought here isn't necessarily what somebody would call a drought in eastern Nebraska, because there are a lot of factors that are just fundamental. So it's hard to make those kinds of calls kind of on a national scale. So it's important, and one of the things that we hope to come out of this process, it's important to get a lot of local data and a lot of regional data so that there is information that is more locally focused, so that we can say, the national people might not say we're in a drought, but gosh, it's been awfully dry lately, and the soil is dry, and stuff is looking stressed, sort of like it is right now. So even if we're not officially in a drought, we can still look at that and say, okay, maybe we need to start taking some initial steps just in case. Does that kind of help?
Yeah,
Okay, now to answer your question, yes, the NRD deals with water. But one of the things that is true about water and humans and how they use water is that it's not just about how many drops are available and when they're available. There's a lot of other factors that go into how humans use water, how they think about water, how they think about using water, particularly in a water short situation. So the reason that we've set up this process that way is that yes, our job is water, but if all we do is think about water and drought, we're gonna miss a boat. We're gonna miss a lot of boats actually. And so the things that we try to come up with to deal with drought are probably not gonna be very effective. So some of the things that we'll be thinking about are strictly related to water, but what we also need to think about when we're thinking about how to deal with drought, even just from our agency perspective, are a little bit bigger than us, even if we don't have jurisdiction or particular authority over something. We still need to be aware that there are these other factors out there. There are other things happening in the community that are also affecting how people are behaving during a drought, how well the community as a whole is going to get through the drought. And we want to try to capture that as much as possible while we're also thinking about what are the things that our particular organization ought to be doing related to the things that we do have specific. So, does that kind of help?
Yep.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, attack your sticky notes. Write down some impacts. Remember, impacts are negative effects of drought. And then wander up here and stick them on the pre, during, and post columns. Wherever you think they go. And then we'll talk about them. Please write legibly.
Just one impact.
One impact per sticky note, yes.
How many? Oh, as many as you can.
As many as you can come up with. And it's okay if a bunch of you say the same thing, that's fine.
I would try to keep an eye on
No copying though. If you independently come up with the same thing, that's fine. Cheating is different. Well, don't be shy. You can go put your sticky notes up there by yourselves. I don't have to do it for you.
But you're saying good.
If it'll move the discussion along, sure, but I'd really rather you got up and walked around. It'll keep oxygen in your brain. And that's a good thing.
We're supposed to pick what category these.
Right. Are these, so for the impact that you wrote down, is that something that happens before a drought, during a drought, or after? No, don't put anything in vulnerability yet. We're going to do that in a minute. Pre, during, and post for your options. Oops, are we out of space?
You guys could get set for modeling, process modeling.
It's yes, definitely a possibility.
How much of a strategy would you need to change over?
The truth is that it mostly it would affect the ingredients that we use to break it down, the enzymes and stuff. As far as the physical parts of the plant, it wouldn't affect it that much. It doesn't get quite the output, quite the energy.
No.
Is this subject matter related, perhaps?
What's that?
Is this a subject matter related discussion? See Rule
Probably.
6?
Maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Rule 6 does say stick to the subject matter during discussion periods. That seems to be the rule everyone's having a hard time with so far. Okay, so you've made a bunch of lists. Leo, you got a couple more there?
Couple more.
Okay. Okay. So, I'm going to read through these really quickly. And I want to do a couple of things with these. So one, I want to see if we all agree that they're in the right category. I want to talk about whether these are things that only happen during that period of time. So for example, do all of these things only happen before a drought, or do they have longer time period consequences, or do you keep seeing the effects of them for longer than just that one period? And I also want to talk about vulnerabilities. Who is particularly affected by the things that are on these lists? Now, again, some of these things may all be the same thing, and that's okay. Some of them may be different. So, and I'll kind of poke you a little bit if necessary, but I don't really want to do that too much. Okay, so in the pre-category, stuff that happens before a drought. We have, now remember, these are impacts. These are effects or negative effects of drought. So we have tillage practices, we have water allocation for crops and people, erosion control, crop planting decisions, planting crop rotation type and varieties, investment protection, maximize crop insurance, and preserve the aquifer. Now, I would kind of fast, but how many of those are impacts? Negative effects of drought, or negative effects of drought?
A lot of them probably be negative effects from previous droughts.
Okay. Okay, so there may be sort of leftover things that are still happening in the system that so that you're already kind of behind the 8 ball for your next drought. Is that what? Okay. Okay.
I guess you change your tillage practices because the last time you lost too much water out of the soil. For the next
True.
time you're trying to
Okay. So what you're talking about is changes that people made after the last drought to try to set themselves up better. Okay. Is that an impact, or is that a strategy to prepare for the next drought?
strategy that was impacted by the last drought. For the
Okay.
last drought.
We're just starting a list here. Called strategies. That's a god awful color. I'm gonna stop using it. I used it a lot the other day and it makes my head hurt. Okay, so the things that I read out, and I can read them again if you need me to, are these Are all of them strategies, or some of them strategies, or none of them strategies?
Read them up again.
Okay. So, well, we could do it one at a time, too.
All right.
Tillage practices. Is that an impact or is that a strategy?
Fred,
Strategy, okay. That,
What about the expense of changing to different tillage?
okay, that could be an impact. Do you want to put that under impact?
It's not cheap. If you have to, it could be as simple as I'm going to buy a pivot because I get more utilization out of my water, and that's very expensive. The cost of changing farming practices because of the drought again. What I was thinking.
Okay, but are you thinking about changes that are made before a drought so that you're setting yourself up better? Or are you thinking about changes that are being made during or right after a drought? Or all of the above?
I think maybe both.
All of the above? Okay. So, if we're looking at tillage practices, it sounds like you think that's a strategy that carries all the way through. Is that right? That you can do it either before a drought or during a drought or after a drought. Okay. All right. The tillage practices, we're going to cover these up, and that's okay. It's something you can do pretty much anytime. Okay, water allocation for crops and people. Is that an impact or is that a strategy?
That's what it's saying.
Okay.
Both.
Why is it both?
Well, it can be a negative impact for people that need the water. But
Okay.
it's also a positive. It's strategy by the government to help preserve water in the aquifers.
Okay, but the way in which it's done may end up causing a negative impact?
Sure.
Okay. All right. Well, then we'll leave it up there. But we might also put it over here. I'm just gonna put this over here. Let's see, paper. If water allocation is a strategy, and really if it's an impact, let's do these one at a time. If water allocation is an impact, when is that negative impact being felt, do you think?
During a drought.
During a drought. Okay. So should it stay over here in the pre category or should we move it to the during?
Water allocation sometimes is determined this time of year prior to planting.
Okay.
So in this area, the snowpack determines whether or not it's going to be allocated. So we get a letter
That's true for surface water.
for surface. Yeah, we have most of them.
Right.
Always limited.
Right. For groundwater, it's a 5-year allocation period irrespective of snowpack.
I was thinking surface water.
Okay. All right. So you're thinking particularly about surface water, but there are also groundwater allocations in this irrigation. Okay. So in that sense, because of that, even if you are just thinking about surface water, is that still something that's happening before drought?
Well, it could be.
Or are you
Often,
thinking about it in terms of the negative impact specifically? Is the negative impact before a drought? Is it during a drought or is it after a drought?
it could be determined prior to a drought. I was thinking of surface water, our
Sure.
supply is so far away from the area
Mm-hmm.
that we can be having a drought here and not there, or vice versa. So if there's water allocation, for example, on surface water, this area doesn't have a hay run, they call it a hay run.
Mm-hmm.
So the alfalfa doesn't get early water, which really hurts the first cutting.
Okay.
It may not be necessarily in the middle of a drought situation.
Okay. And it may not even be related to a drought that's happening here. Okay. So it could be before, but it could also be during.
Definitely.
Is that what you're saying? Okay. All right. Well, that's not going to make sense if it's relative. I can write down there. Okay, erosion control. Is that an impact or is that a strategy? You have the yellow sticky note. You want to tell us about what
I
you're
don't know
thinking?
why I put it over there, probably because there's too many in the other category.
There's not a limit. You can
I
put
think-
all of them in one
Right.
category if you wanted to.
I think it might be during thinking about it now.
Okay, all right, so you want to move it, we all agree this should go to during erosion control? Makes more sense? Okay. Move that over here. I've got a lot of during. Okay, we're gonna keep this in. Crop planting decisions. Should I give up higher consumption crops? Is that a pre-drought impact? Is that a during or after? Do we agree that it's pre?
It can be pre, because, and this would be particularly if you've got either restrictions on aquifers or if your aquifer is already depleted, somewhat depleted. You may want to be planting less water usage crops,
Okay.
which would be a negative impact.
Okay. When you talk about having an aquifer that's already depleted, are you thinking about it being depleted because of drought circumstances, existing drought circumstances? Or are you thinking about it being depleted just because of other stuff that was going on that doesn't really have anything to do with drought? What are you thinking of?
I'll just use Pumpkin Creek as an example. It's we know that we have overdeveloped that area.
Okay.
So we understand that we have two things. We have regulations,
Mhm.
and we also have just naturally a depleted, not totally depleted, but reduced level in our aquifer.
Okay.
So I think the negative impact is if we use less water consumption crops to do two things. First of all, to maintain that level, and also in preparation for a drought. When we have a drought, there's a bigger requirement for that.
Okay. All right. Makes sense to me. Is everybody happy with it? Okay. Planting crop rotation types and varieties, which is kind of the same, or is kind of related to what we were just talking about. I don't remember who had the grayish sticky notes. Oh, it was you. Did you have something additional in mind?
It was on the same way as what
Is
Leo
that what
was
that
saying,
was?
yeah.
Okay. Okay. Investment protection. I think that was you too. What do you have in mind there?
What Leo mentioned early on,
Okay.
planning for protection financially and soil and your environment.
Okay. Do you see, is that an impact or is that a strategy?
It can be both. It can be an ongoing strategy that you
Okay.
incorporate continuously.
Okay.
You might want to up the ante a little bit if you think you're going to get into a drought.
Sure.
Kind of cover your bases a little better.
Okay. So, but in light of that, does it make more sense to be over here? Or does it make more sense to be over here?
It could be in both. I can see it.
Okay. Well, I
both.
can write it. Okay, and you're saying that's something that you should be doing continually. So that's something that you could even be doing during a drought as well and afterwards? Okay. All right. Maximize crop insurance is, I think, essentially the same thing, or is related to that investment protection that he's talking about, or are you thinking of something
What I
different?
meant by that was that the negative impact is the higher, you can buy anywhere from NAP insurance, which is just a basic coverage,
Mhm.
all the way up to 85%,
Okay.
and the higher levels cost more.
Okay, so the negative impact is those increased
Cost.
premiums.
Mhm.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna write that down. Increase your rates. Is that something that, and you're thinking of that as something that happens prior to a drought If
You
somebody
do it, you do it all the time.
does it, that happens all the time. Okay. So I'm also going to write that here. Is that something you think that would also happen in after a drought?
You do it all the time. You have a bank, you have.
But do you see, but my question though is that, so if you decide you want to get that extra coverage or the bank makes you do it,
Yeah.
and you have that higher premium, but once you get to this, particularly once you get to this post-drought phase, is it true that your rates will go up maybe even more, either because people are making a lot of claims or the banks think that you need even more coverage in addition to what you'd already gotten, and so your rates go up even more than they already had? Is that true?
It could be a strategy. Because
Okay.
if in fact if you watch these drought monitors, which a lot of people do, and it appears that you may be looking at a drought situation, it could be a strategy. I mean, you may raise, a lot of people have a 70% coverage and they may increase it to 85.
Okay. So that's more of a coverage question, and the rates go along with that. But the strategy is related to maximizing the coverage. And that, again, is something that happens always, so that would carry all the way through?
Yeah, you'll always have it, or most people will always have coverage.
Okay. Well, you would certainly hope so. All right. I'm going to write everything. Okay, preserving the aquifer is related to what you were talking
Yeah,
about.
and that
before.
would probably be a strategy. Probably
Okay.
a strategy. You know, try to, you know, again, I don't care if it's.
Is it a mitigation strategy? Is that something you do beforehand?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Is that something
Yeah,
you want to do?
when I say I'm talking about, this is particularly for, well, the aquifer, obviously aquifer. Trying to preserve that if in fact you're in a vulnerable area. You know, two things. If you're in the bottom end of the Pumpkin Creek, you probably want to make sure that you have adequate reserves in the drought years. And in the upper Pumpkin Creek, you would want to make sure that you're preserving the level of your rock.
Okay, so you just said vulnerable, which we're going to get to in a second, but we can do that right now, at least for this one. So, well, and actually, you do it for this whole category before I move on. So, vulnerabilities. In the situation of that limited aquifer supply, so that you're already doing things to try to maintain that as much as possible. Who or what is particularly vulnerable in that kind of situation?
Who is?
Who or what?
Well, primarily the landowner producer.
Okay. Is it all landowner producers? Is it a particular subset of landowners or producers that are particularly affected in that sort of situation?
I don't know what you mean by that.
So is it somebody with a fairly small operation that is hit harder? Is it someone with a larger operation that is hit harder? Does it matter? Is everybody hit sort of equally hard in that situation?
The guy that's more leveraged is probably going to get the hard work.
Okay. Okay, so maybe larger producers would actually.
Not necessarily.
Okay. Okay. So who
Probably has
then?
more to do with how well established it is,
Okay.
as far as, debt to asset ratio type deal, how much you can afford to lose in those years. So,
Okay, so maybe producers
Well, the
who.
risk exposure is what
Okay.
you're looking at. I mean, if you're just starting out and you've got all you got is sweat equity built up, your risk is pretty low. You can't handle much. Excuse me. But as you get established and you get a little better equity built up, your risk isn't quite as great because you can absorb a little bit of loss.
Okay.
So it's a matter of what your exposure is.
Okay.
It doesn't matter the size of the operation at
Okay.
all.
Okay. So it's more about the strength of the establishment or the amount of equity in the establishment? Okay. I'm gonna try to phrase it. What else?
No, he,
I gotta stick to this subject.
Good.
Wondering
I'm glad to
why.
hear it. Okay. Okay, is it also fair to say that the aquifer itself is vulnerable? Or are we only talking about humans?
what?
Is it fair to say that the aquifer itself is vulnerable in what you were talking about, or are we only talking about people? There's no right answer to that question.
I think it's wrong.
Okay.
Certainly, aquifer is vulnerable.
Okay. Yeah, aquifer itself. All right. So in the stuff that we've talked about so far in this pre-category, are there other groups of people, particular characteristics, things that are also vulnerable when we're talking about things like water allocation, crop planting decisions, your crop insurance rates? We've already got these guys. Is there anybody else or anything else that is affected by those particularly?
Every ag-related business and beyond.
Okay, how does it affect them? Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I was thinking of the ethanol plant. You could speak to that better than I, but if corn's a high water consumption crop, and in the midst of a drought, maybe he doesn't have the supply as readily available,
Okay.
whether it's, he has to import further to get the needs that he has to run his business. But I think it goes all the way to the vehicle dealerships and probably most other businesses as well. Everyone's impacted.
Okay, what do those impacts look like? So like when you're talking about vehicle dealerships, they're selling fewer things. Why are they selling fewer things? What's happening?
Ag drives the whole time here.
Okay.
It's not ag, nobody, that's where the money starts at here.
Okay, so you're looking at individual farm income, disposable income that's available, the impact, the consequences to that income from these kinds of things.
Yeah, and it could be
Okay.
positive or negative, quite honestly.
Sure.
If if production is low, prices might be higher, and you may not be in, the drought we spoke of earlier. It seemed like it went right down the North Platte Valley, but the edges of that, you could see on those maps that he was pointing out, Banner County in places wasn't as heavily impacted. So some people profited from,
Okay.
others suffering is always the case in agriculture.
Okay. But it just, so in terms of how the businesses see that, is the consequence to them sort of based on that balance of who is doing the profiting and who is doing the suffering then?
To some extent.
Okay.
I think so.
Okay. So the impacts, so if ag is being impacted in an economic sense, that impact doesn't necessarily look the same to everybody, sort of depending on who is on the losing end and who is on the winning end, if you can call it that. Is that fair to say? Okay. So I'm going to write down vehicle dealerships as an example.
Vehicle,
Probably a bigger, more direct impact is the agricultural equipment dealers. I mean, they have a direct impact.
I think it goes all the way, just, like right now, some restaurants and stuff say they have to have people going in businesses been poor for them, you know.
Okay.
But that would be because of due to prices on crops now, but it just seems like if ag suffers, the whole area suffers.
Right, but it starts to look kind of the same. You know, drought may be the reason that ag is suffering, or it may be low crop prices. But you're right, the way that effect looks can happen outside of a drought too, and we are seeing some of that right now. And how much?
Land sales are impacted, of course.
Okay, right.
I put that on the post. Yeah, I put that on post.
Okay, we're actually gonna expand on that a little bit. Okay, anything else on the pre before we go to the group? Okay, so we have a lot of things in the during. Let's see, weeds flourish during a drought. Negative impact, yes, okay. Crop prices and availability. Impact, yes. Is that something that, and really for both of those, is that something that happens only during a drought, or is that something that carries on into after your drought is officially over?
Other factors could influence that, but
Like
a drought really impacts it.
Okay, okay. What are some of the other factors that might influence that?
Oh gosh, the size of the crop, if there's a bumper crop, area-wide or nationwide,
Okay,
or global-wide for that goes. If it depresses the market, we're gonna feel it here.
okay,
There's a shortage or earthquake or something where shipments can't get through, a strike on the coast.
okay.
That could affect it. So, I mean, there's a ripple effect on all of this.
Sure, sure.
Well,
okay, go ahead.
In regard to the crop prices, if you're talking about a regional drought,
Mhm.
you have drought in western Nebraska or just Nebraska,
Mhm.
may not impact prices at all because we're in a global economy.
Okay,
And the worst thing you can have is a drought and low prices.
yes,
Reduce yields and reduce prices. They don't necessarily follow. But if you have as you mentioned, a national or an international drought, prices are probably going to be higher. It may offset to some extent the reduction in production.
in yields, okay. So this is a negative, can be a negative impact of drought, but it's kind of driven by scale in a way. And, you know, global factors, other factors that may make that worse or slightly better. Okay. River overgrowth from lack of flows. I assume you're talking about Russian olives and Phragmites.
Yeah, stuff like that.
The invasive species. Okay. Is that something that is just during a drought? Is that something that continues to be an impact after a drought?
I think it can continue to be an impact. You know, the river channels get choked with that overgrowth, and then when it does bust loose, it can cause more major flooding, I think.
Okay. Ooh, did anybody say flooding? Anybody write flooding on their sticky note? Let's talk about flooding for a second. Good job. Do floods happen during a drought? Can floods be an effect or a negative impact of drought? Got a yes. Got a maybe.
The question again is, ask the question again.
Okay. Can floods happen during a drought, and or can they be a negative effect of drought?
Well, they can certainly happen during a drought.
Okay.
I mean, that's happened here,
Yes.
multitude of things.
Right.
Can they happen as a result of drought?
Can they be a negative impact of drought?
Well, they do a lot of damage when it floods, when everything's dry, the dirt really moves.
Good. So should we add that?
Yeah, what was that?
I think there's one up there,
Yeah, well, that's what I had.
as far as the like erosion deal somewhere.
Right. Well, we had talked about erosion control, which is related to that. That's the thing I'm trying to
Yeah,
get.
California is
to
a good example of what happens
That's right.
Exactly. Okay.
post drought.
So So what's something that is related to erosion control then is the potential negative impact from a flash flood, yeah? Is that sort of what we're saying? Okay, I'm gonna write that down.
Whatever happened in California on that spillway? Did they get that, apparently they got it under control.
I think they did.
Yeah.
Okay. Food prices. And we have unstable commodity prices, which is right next to that. I think those things are sort of related, but not exactly. So we'll sort of take those apart. Food prices. Is that something that can be negatively affected only during a drought? Is that something that carries through after a drought? Okay.
Probably more than after effect.
Yeah, it's kind of
Okay.
a delayed deal.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you want to keep it in during or do you want to move it to after?
Post probably better.
Okay. So unstable commodity prices. It's kind of related, but kind of not. Is that also something that happens just during a drought? Is that also something that happens after a drought?
Must be a big drought, widespread drought.
Okay, so it's kind of related to what we were talking about before, where drought is a factor, but it might not be the only one, and then there's the question of scale. Okay, actually, let me write that down. Good. Scale. External factor. Okay, cost of manufacturing. That was you. What do you have in mind there?
Well, there's a lot. One of the things that I always think about when we first came out here and started building the plant, a lot of people, I went around to a lot of different communities in the area. And there was lots of questions about smell and things of that nature, but one of the biggest questions was about water usage. And so I tried to talk about that in depth, and I honestly spent a lot of time trying to learn those things myself, and I wish I had this with me, but it's on the EPA had it on their website for a long time, and I assume they still do, but it talked about in all manufacturing sectors, how many gallons, like for us, we use about 3 gallons of water to produce a gallon of ethanol. Now, a gallon of that goes back in the feed, a gallon of that goes back to the river, and a gallon of that is used in the production. But it talked about like a Sunday newspaper, the average Sunday newspaper, and don't quote me on these, but it would be like 30 gallons. A pair of leather shoes was 110 gallons of water. So that was what I was thinking, just manufacturing all across.
Okay.
So it affects it. And now if you're talking about just a local drought, you're probably talking about it affects something like the ethanol plant and the sugar factory and some of those things.
Mm-hmm.
But you talk about widespread drought and what we've seen some in California and along the coast, or the western part of the U.S., it can affect manufacturing all the way across the country. I mean, the prices of manufacturing.
Okay, the cost of manufacturing. All right, so this also has a scale component. Just like commodity prices. Okay. Do you see those effects happening only during a drought? Do they tend to propagate after a drought? Continue to happen after a drought?
No, they definitely continue to happen after
Okay.
a drought.
Okay. Negative impact on wildlife. So you.
That was me.
Okay.
Well, as your stream flows reduce, and if your forage reduces, that's a definite impact on wildlife.
Okay. Is that only true during a drought? Does that also happen after a drought? Or continue to happen after?
I don't think as much, Your post is that you've lost population.
Okay. Okay, so it maybe take a while for that population to recover, even though the negative impact isn't continuing to.
I'm not a wildlife specialist, but
Sure. You're actually right. Okay. So do you think it's fair to put that under post as well, or?
could be.
Okay. Let's see, herd reductions. And Trevor talked about it. Trevor, right? Good, I got one. Talked about remembering herd reductions in the past is happening, that's during a drought. Is that something that happens only during a drought? In other words, do people tend to build their herds back up once the drought is over? Did they
My
wait a
parents had it
while?
done, back.
They still have it?
No,
Okay.
well, they're in 200, they went to 60 and now we're up to like 140.
Okay.
I don't think they'll probably go for that just because that's a big loss to buy them and then sell them. So try to average it out. Seems like we have enough drought that just plan on it.
Okay. Okay, so your parents' herd management decisions continued to be affected by that experience of drought?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Okay. The whole local economy suffers. Which we kind of started talking about in the vulnerabilities too. Is that I think, yes, the greens are you. Is that something that is true only during a drought? Does that happen after a drought too?
Depends until recovery happens, I guess.
Okay, but we're talking about the recovery period, so.
Yeah, that'd be.
Okay, all right. So. The economy suffers.
Recovery as far as economical as recovery, I don't know.
Okay.
When it
Well,
starts
it
raining again, it takes a while to get your money back.
Exactly, okay. Population declines from the effects of drought. So, talk about that a little bit.
Well, if the effects of drought include businesses suffering, they'll reduce their employment, their staff, etc.
Okay,
People move to find jobs.
okay, okay. Is that something that continues to be true after the drought, or is that something that happens only during? Reduced crop yields, which we started to talk about already, in the prices and availability earlier. Lower levels in the aquifer. Is that something that happens just during the drought? I mean, you talked about Pumpkin Creek in particular being sort of always in that position. In a way.
But we've seen the levels
Up and down.
up
right?
and down, and
Okay.
we watch Pumpkin Creek particularly because of its vulnerability.
Right.
But it'll happen here too in the valley.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how long, you don't have to be all scientific in answering this. How long do you think that it takes for those aquifer levels to recover?
Well, will they ever? And where they were to start with, where we started.
What's your starting point? Where are
Yeah.
you going to start from? You're going to go back to your,
That's true. It
1800?
does depend on what your key hero
right,
is.
where's your
Mhm.
starting point at?
Okay, so even without answering that question, do you think that lower levels in the aquifer continue to be true after a drought is officially over?
It could be.
Is that the
Could
point of the NRD?
It is actually. That's why there's.
I think that the levels are related to rainfall, precipitation.
In the valley, they're also related to how much water is coming into these lovely surface waters now.
Absolutely.
To that point,
Mhm.
when we suffered the lengthy drought and McConaughey went clear down, and the projection was it would be X amount of years before it came back. I don't remember those numbers. It recovered much faster than expected.
It rained a lot in 2011.
Yeah.
They got lucky.
But it can be a shorter recovery period.
Sure.
in that regard.
Sure. Now to be clear, we haven't started talking about short-term versus long-term in recovery. We're going to do that. But you're right. It can be something that happens in a single year, like 2011, but not necessarily.
And groundwater may not have that ability. I don't.
Depends on the geology, really. Depends on a lot of things. Geology is one of the chief ones. I'm glad somebody said this. Domestic livestock wells running low or drying up.
Yeah, particularly my experience with the Gearing Valley area and other areas in the valley where the wells that, as the elevation rises in those areas, they dropped much quicker, of course, than the valley floor did. In fact, there were some that were almost gone until the water would come back in the canals and replenish the groundwater near those.
Are you on the south side of the river?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. If Gary Fort Laramie isn't running, nobody's got water.
And that early water, that allocation impacts that dramatically as well. Those wells out there off the rim, on the rims of the valley.
Why is it so much worse on the south side of the river?
Because I can sort of point at this map, although it doesn't go quite that far left. So Gary Fort Laramie is up here, so extend this way. But this whole swath here, the river is right here. This whole swath here is the alluvium. So this is where a lot of people in the valley get their water. A lot of the recharge to this aquifer comes from surface water canals, but this isn't, it looks pretty evenly, it looks sort of equidistant on either side of the river here, so it looks like it's about even. Once you get up here to the west, the part of the alluvium on the south side of the river is really narrow and is fairly shallow compared to the chunk that's on the north side of the river. So it goes dry a lot more easily. And there isn't, because there just isn't enough aquifer material there, it can't hold the large volumes of water and storage in the way that you can see on the north side of the river. So yeah, if Gary Fort Laramie didn't exist, a lot, and most of the wells that are on that south side of the river right there wouldn't be there.
Wasn't it true, and Neil could probably speak to it better, that, remember when we were in that drought and how valuable those groundwater wells became on ag land, but a lot of them hadn't been used for so many years, and when they were trying to fire them up, the pumps weren't deep enough because the aquifer had dropped more than they realized, and so there was a ton of work to get them up and going. So that not just domestic.
In the early 2000s, we had
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it's obvious. It's and I was when I moved to, I'm not a native of this area, but I came here. I thought, why in the hell aren't they making concrete canals and all this? And it took me a while to figure out that our aquifer was dependent on the flood irrigation and on the canals, this series of canals. And so I think your effort to send water earlier into these canals is huge. I think if we could get another 30, 40 days in these canals, it'd be huge.
Hope so.
I'd like to see that more often instead of seeing the river reach high levels in early spring.
And start earlier.
Yes, I would think that'd be the.
Yeah, since we know it's going to happen, why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we doing it now?
Why send it over its banks downstream when it doesn't do anybody any good except for damage?
Part of that's canal operations.
Yes.
They have a great deal of maintenance to do in the off season, and that takes time. Okay. So reduced stocking rates is related to herd reduction. Let's see, reduced revenue flow is related, I think, to the whole economic impact. But it's also sort of what we were talking about here, that reduced revenues to individuals means that they have less income to spend, and so then you start seeing that in the businesses too. Is that something that continues to be true after a drought?
Not to the
Does it
same
depend?
degree, probably not to
Okay,
the same degree.
not so much. Okay.
But on that same line, during a drought and everything, not only do you have a loss of revenue, but you've got higher cost involved.
Right.
If you're gonna dry lot your herd and start gathering up cheapest feed as you can,
Mm-hmm.
that's extra added cost, machinery and time.
Well,
Okay.
And typically, inputs aren't very cheap.
Right.
We're talking about livestock.
Yeah, you get that
Drought.
situation, everything costs more, it seems like.
Okay, so
Well, and then
you
gotta
actually
pay for
wrote.
it
Okay.
after, too.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
so you lose money, then you put it on a note and you pay for it when it gets better, so it lasts a long time. Or you
The effects of or the
Yeah.
consequences of that. Okay. So you actually wrote prioritize inputs.
Mhm.
Is that kind of what you were thinking
Yeah.
about? Is those higher input
If
costs
you've
that
got
are
just
coming
X
along
amount
with
of
that?
dollars to work on, and you try
Okay.
to maintain or survive,
Right.
you're gonna have to really sharpen your pencil.
Right. I'm gonna write higher input costs here. Okay. Reduce stream flow. We kind of talked about that. Sort of. We talked about erosion. Limited recreation. Okay. Is that something that's, the recreation effects, is that something that's happening just during the drought? Does that continue to happen after the drought?
Reading the papers when Lake McConaughey goes down,
Mm-hmm.
we need more water. And they send out ads, oh, we got plenty of beaches, so it affects them. They want, especially Lake McConaughey. They want them tourists in there.
They do. Okay. But do those effects, and it sort of depends on the time that it takes to recover, but do those effects continue to be seen after a drought, or maybe not?
Well, I
Probably
think it continues because
Okay.
if you've reduced your wildlife population, it takes a while to replenish it.
Okay.
And I'll tell you what, we don't have quite the recreation on rivers, and with Lake McConaughey as an example, he mentioned, I said Lake McConaughey, I'm talking about Lake Minitere. There isn't quite the recreation opportunities.
Okay. All right. We talked about all of this. Great. So let's take a break a minute. We have 9 minutes before my little alarm goes off. Let's talk about vulnerability some more. So we talked about who's vulnerable with some of these pre-drought impacts or pre-drought factors. Who, that we haven't talked about yet, who or what is vulnerable during a drought, considering all these things that we just got done talking about.
Wildlife.
Okay. Who else? Who's affected by, like a little bit in the post, but also during possibly, say, higher manufacturing costs, or so you have higher input costs on the raw materials end, you have higher manufacturing costs. What does that do to the price of the final product?
Well, it depends on the scope of the drought.
Sure, but we're not really thinking about the scope of the drought. If your raw materials costs go up, your manufacturing costs, your processing costs go up at the plant, you spit out your final product from the plant, what happens to the price of that final product?
They increase also.
Those go, okay. Who's affected by that? I mean, sure, everybody's affected who buys it, but who is particularly affected by those increased finished product prices?
How about the manufacturer? If the product isn't being sold at the higher price, you gotta cut back production or close
Okay.
down a little bit. Could be
Okay.
the producer themselves, the manufacturer.
Okay.
Well, if your price go up, your consumers are impacted.
Okay. Are they all impacted the same way?
So I would say it this way. So we have two major products that we produce out there.
Mhm.
One being ethanol that everyone thinks of, but the other major product is feed
Mhm.
for the cattle in the area. So if you look at that, that certainly will increase, which will also affect the same group that the corn prices and the commodity prices have affected. And to some degree, maybe the ethanol too. And again, that depends on where you're going with it and what's going on nationwide. But locally, my gosh, most all of our feed goes within a 35-mile radius.
But what would happen is if you have to go further out to buy your corn, the price goes up, which impacts the price of the
The feed.
byproduct.
Mhm.
Right? Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
It seems like maybe that's what you're getting to. It seems like it kind of multiplies on those same folks that are already suffering the causes of the effects of the drought, and then it just again costs more and more and more.
Okay.
Are you looking for a fixed income group? Like,
Maybe. Who do you have in mind?
I don't know. It seems like you're fishing.
I am.
That's why we're here with the fish.
So let me ask it this way. We're going to just pretend for a second. Let's say that there's a local cattle feeder who's buying your newly increased price feed because now all your costs went up. So now that guy's grain prices or feed prices went up. And he's going to sell that cow to a local butcher who's going to sell that meat in a local grocery store. Okay. Is the amount that he sells that cow for, sort of ignore market cattle prices for a second.
Right.
If he's just selling that to a local dude.
Right.
The amount that he sells that to the local dude for also goes up? Okay.
Yes,
Okay. So when,
Not necessarily, because if
Okay.
it's an area drought that's pretty stressed, you might have a mass movement to slaughter and your price
Might.
would be decreased.
That's true.
So
that's true, they might.
you might take a hit
Okay.
there too.
Okay. So if that happens, then the guy who's selling the cattle took a hit because now his cattle's not worth as much. But let's say for a second that didn't happen. So that cattle is now selling for more. That cow is selling for more. So when, hang on, let me finish. And then we'll get to you. So then when the meat products from that slaughtered cow get sold at the local grocery store, do they cost more now?
in theory.
In theory. So,
But you have all that market stuff in there you want to ignore, and that doesn't happen.
You know,
no, I know that. I know, but I'm trying to get you to see a certain thing. Since you asked what I was fishing for, I'm trying to show you what I'm fishing for without telling you. So, if your price of beef, doesn't really matter what kind of beef or what product we're talking about, if the price of beef goes up all of a sudden, does that affect everybody in the same way?
I would answer, but you shut me up.
I didn't shut you up. What do you think the answer is, Leo?
I think what happens is that if you want to talk about that cow,
Mhm.
what happens during the drought
Okay.
is that there's a huge liquidation.
It's true.
And this is the best example is the last drought we had. Huge liquidation. And the drought I'm really referring to the ones that were south.
Mm-hmm.
Cows got awfully cheap. Now, which says that the cost, that the price, theoretically, the price at the counter
Okay.
should go down.
Okay.
That doesn't necessarily always happen,
Sure.
but it did.
Okay.
Okay. In the post-recovery,
Okay.
during the period of the drought, price goes down because there's a huge supply
Okay.
on the market.
Okay.
Post-recovery,
Okay.
prices go up
Because.
because they're trying to replenish their herds because they've got now have feed
Okay,
for forage. Consequently, the price goes up.
okay.
Now,
Now,
that's,
does that affect everybody the same way?
uh,
Regardless of when that price
everybody,
increase
what
happens.
sector what sector?
For the consumer, it would affect them positively in the sell-off period.
During the drought.
Okay.
In the
Okay,
livestock
but when
market,
prices go up, are all consumers equal?
No,
No. How are they not equal?
because the consumer lags. There's a time lag in that.
Sure.
With the producer, it's immediate.
Do all consumers,
The consumer
Right,
would be
but
6
we've
months.
talked about producers being vulnerable. I'm trying to get you to the consumer end. Do all-
they're
do
not
all
to the same
cons-
scale or-
It's not at the same time, you're right, and it may or may not be at the same scale. But does that mean that consumers or some set of them are not vulnerable at all?
They're affected.
Okay.
I don't know vulnerable, like it's a lifestyle threatening situation.
How do you think it might be? Do all,
Not everybody eats beef.
well, I don't eat beef, I'm a vegetarian, but, so I don't care what cow prices are, but do all consumers have the same amount of money to spend on food? Okay. So if they don't, who's going to be negatively affected by higher food prices?
Lower class.
Okay. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay. You got
But
there.
it would still have to be a really widespread drought, I think. I mean, a local drought probably isn't gonna affect it that much here.
No, that's true. But does that mean we should ignore it?
No.
Okay. So they're still vulnerable.
Usually your retailers are honed into the consumer that they're skeptical of jumping the prices in too large amounts.
They should
They're
be.
really
You would hope
trying
so.
to keep that really narrow adjustments for that same reason, to keep the consumer always coming back.
That's true, but they only have so much room to move
Right,
if they still want to be able to keep their business open.
right.
So there's a certain flexibility in how they set prices, but there's probably a hard minimum for a lot of things. Maybe not everything, but. And that hard minimum is partly driven by what they have to pay to get it to their store. Whether that's from a grower, the grower's end, or that's a processing end sort of thing.
But your consumer also isn't locked into one specific commodity. They can choose a lower protein source.
They
lower
can.
price, and different protein sources.
They can, but what effect does that have if you as a consumer, because you can't afford that now higher priced thing, what effect might that have on you
As a producer,
as a consumer?
as a consumer, instead of 3 times a week, maybe twice.
Okay.
Maybe, like I say, a different source of protein,
Okay.
animal protein, instead of beef, maybe chicken.
Okay.
Stuff like that. But I still have a hard time believing that effect on the consumer is going to be at the same scale of magnitude it is on the producer.
It might not be. I'm not saying
I-
they.
I-
I'm not saying
in
they have to be the
reality, I
same.
don't think it is.
Sure, and that's fine. But does that mean they are not vulnerable at all? Just because it's not the same.
Their vulnerability is there,
Okay.
but it's not. How would I say?
There are a lot of things that will impact that meat price.
Okay.
During the drought, there was a huge liquidation, consequently, more meat on the market. Prices went down. Post recovery,
Mhm.
the cows weren't there, obviously, they've been killed, so there weren't as many calves. Consequently, prices went higher. Now, and the other thing that happened during that period of time was cheaper corn got because of the excess corn.
Mhm.
Consequently, feeders made cattle bigger. All of a sudden, you get a collapse in price again
Mm-hmm.
because there's more meat in the market. And we also had cheap poultry and pork. So there's a lot of things that impact that market. But drought certainly will have an
Feed
impact.
into it. Okay. This is a good stopping point. take a 15-minute break, get some snacks, make some friends. Bathrooms are right there. Go run around the block, indulge socially unacceptable habits, whatever. And we will start
Can
again.
we get into more of that last one?
Which one?
Can you get?
Socially unacceptable habits. Do you want a list so you can go get on that right now? I'm gonna.